The P-51 Mustang should have disappeared the moment World War II ended. That was the belief. Jets had arrived. Speed had won. Propeller fighters were finished. And that belief was wrong, because after 1945, wars stopped following the rules planners expected. Runways vanished. Front lines collapsed. Pilots needed time over the battlefield, not raw speed. And the aircraft everyone called obsolete kept solving problems no jet could. The Mustang didn't survive because it was modern. It survived because modern systems failed when war turned messy. It fought in conflicts no one prepared for. It flew missions it was never designed to fly. And in doing so, it quietly reshaped how post-war air power actually worked. This is not a story about nostalgia. It's the story of a machine that exposed a dangerous assumption and proved that being outdated can sometimes change the course of war. With this story, because what kept the P-51 Mustang alive after World War II reveals a mistake modern wars still repeat. In 1945, the world did not simply celebrate the end of World War II. It rewrote its understanding of war itself. Victory had come with a lesson that seemed undeniable. Speed had won. Jets flew faster than anything with a propeller. They climbed higher, crossed borders quicker, and symbolized a clean break from the brutal improvisation of the past 6 years. To military planners, politicians, and engineers alike, the conclusion felt obvious. The age of the propeller fighter was over. This belief was not emotional. It was systematic. Every air force that could afford it rushed toward jets. Budgets followed the same logic. Training pipelines were rebuilt. Doctrines were rewritten. The future of air power, it was decided, would be sleek, fast, and untouchable. And in that future, there was no place for the P-51 Mustang. During the war, the Mustang had been everything a modern military wanted: long range, high-altitude performance, and reliability at scale. It escorted bombers deep into enemy territory and helped dismantle entire air forces. But those achievements belonged to a kind of war everyone hoped would never happen again. Peace demanded efficiency. Jets promised certainty. So, the Mustang was reclassified, not officially, but culturally. It became a symbol of a solved problem, something that had done its job and could now be discarded without regret. In hangars and storage depots, rows of Mustangs sat quietly as planners debated what truly mattered in the next war. What no one questioned was the assumption beneath all of it, that future wars would resemble the conditions jets needed to succeed. That assumption went unchallenged because it felt rational. Wars would be short. Infrastructure would be intact. Airfields would be secure. Supply lines would function. Technology would dominate chaos. But history rarely rewards assumptions, especially when they are shared by everyone at once. Because while militaries prepared for a clean, fast, jet-powered future, the world itself was breaking apart in ways no doctrine had anticipated. Colonial empires collapsed. New nations formed overnight. Borders shifted faster than maps could be updated. Conflicts no longer waited for perfect conditions. And when war returned, as it always does, it did not arrive on long, paved runways. It arrived in mountains, deserts, frozen valleys, and half-destroyed airfields. It arrived where logistics failed first. It arrived where theory stopped working. Suddenly, the advantages of jets came with costs that planners had minimized. Fuel consumption, limited time over the battlefield. Maintenance demands required infrastructure that simply did not exist. Speed, once a solution, became a liability when pilots needed patience instead of velocity. This was the moment the post-war vision began to fracture. And it was here, inside this gap between expectation and reality, that the Mustang quietly returned to relevance. Not because it was better technology, but because it asked less of the world around it. The P-51 did not need perfect runways. It did not demand extensive support systems. It could stay airborne when jets had to leave. It could operate from places that barely qualified as airfields. In wars where control was fragile and time mattered more than speed, those traits became decisive. Yet no one had planned for this. The Mustang's survival after World War II was not a revival driven by nostalgia or sentiment. It was the unintended consequence of a strategic miscalculation, the belief that the future would behave predictably. Act 1 of this story is not about an airplane. It is about a failure of imagination. Because the moment militaries declared the propeller fighter obsolete, they locked themselves into a vision of war that reality would soon dismantle. And when that vision collapsed, they were forced to reach backward not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. The P-51 Mustang did not survive the post-war world by accident. It survived because the world after 1945 refused to follow the rules it had been designed around. And that mistake would cost lives, reshape air combat, and give an obsolete machine a second career no one had intended. Once the assumption was set, the outcome became inevitable. If propeller fighters no longer had a future, then keeping them made no sense. After 1945, the United States and its allies faced a problem they had never planned for, not scarcity, but abundance. Factories that had been optimized for total war had produced aircraft in numbers that peace could not justify. The P-51 Mustang was no longer a weapon. It was inventory. Across the United States, Europe, and the Pacific, airfields filled with silent rows of fighters. They were parked wingtip to wingtip, engines sealed, paperwork stamped with a single word that mattered more than their combat record: surplus. Maintaining them cost money, storing them cost money, and in a world convinced that jets had made them irrelevant, every dollar spent on an old fighter looked like a mistake. The solution was efficiency, cold, methodical, and unsentimental. Air forces began to dismantle the very fleets that had helped win the war. Perfectly functional aircraft were stripped of usable components. Airframes were cut apart. Wings were broken. Fuselages were crushed, not because they had failed, but because they were no longer needed, at least not on paper. This was not chaos. It was policy. The Mustang's fate was decided not by its performance, but by a spreadsheet. Wartime production numbers that once symbolized industrial triumph now worked against it. There were simply too many. And abundance, in a post-war system focused on modernization, became a liability. Some aircraft were sold at auction for prices that barely reflected their raw materials. Others were transferred abroad under security agreements designed to stabilize regions without investing heavily in them. In both cases, the underlying message was the same. The Mustang was expendable. What made this moment dangerous was not the act of disposal itself, but the confidence behind it. Military planners were not uncertain. They were certain. Certain that future wars would be faster, cleaner, more technical. Certain that piston-engine fighters belonged to a closed chapter of history. That certainty erased caution. There was no serious debate about preserving large numbers of aircraft, just in case. No long-term hedging against a future that might look different from the models being drawn in briefing rooms. The past had been brutal enough. The future, it was believed, would be controlled. But war does not respect control. As Mustangs disappeared from inventories, something else disappeared with them. Flexibility, the ability to fight in imperfect conditions, the tolerance for improvisation, the acceptance that reliability sometimes matters more than innovation. The post-war system traded redundancy for elegance, and for a brief moment, it seemed justified. Jets dazzled crowds at air shows. They set records. They defined prestige. Nations measured their air power not by what could actually fight tomorrow, but by what symbolized technological relevance today. The Mustang could not compete with that image, so it faded, not suddenly, but quietly. Not in combat, but in storage yards and scrap yards. Yet this phase, the Mustang's apparent death, was not the end of the story. It was the removal of a safety net, a decision made under the assumption that the world had entered a stable era, where war would conform to expectations instead of shattering them. That assumption would not last long, because even as Mustangs were being cut apart and sold off, the global order created by World War II was already unraveling. New conflicts were forming at the edges of empires. Infrastructure was weaker than planners assumed, and the conditions jets required to dominate existed far less often than anyone wanted to admit. The P-51 Mustang did not survive this period because it was protected. It survived because it slipped through the cracks. A few were stored instead of destroyed. A few were transferred instead of scrapped. A few were ignored, not valuable enough to modernize, not urgent enough to eliminate. And those overlooked aircraft would soon become essential. Act 2 ends with a disappearance, but also with a warning. When a system declares something obsolete too quickly, it does more than discard equipment. It discards options. And when the world stops behaving as predicted, options become everything. The turn of war did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived as a test, and the future failed it. When conflict erupted again in the early post-war years, commanders discovered that their most advanced aircraft were brilliant in theory and fragile in reality. Jets were fast, but speed solved fewer problems than expected. The battles unfolding across fractured regions demanded something different, something no one had prioritized: time. Pilots needed time over the battlefield to see, to react, to support troops whose positions shifted by the hour. Jets burned fuel at a rate that turned endurance into a liability. Missions became short sprints rather than sustained presence. Aircraft that looked unstoppable on paper were forced to leave just as the fighting intensified. Then there was the ground. Runways were no longer long, smooth, and secure. Many airfields were improvised, damaged, or barely maintained. Jets required precision infrastructure, paved surfaces, clean intakes, stable supply chains. When those conditions vanished, so did the jet's advantage. Engines flamed out from debris. Maintenance crews struggled to keep aircraft operational in environments that punished complexity. The future had arrived into the wrong war. This was not a failure of engineering. It was a failure of assumptions. Post-war doctrine had imagined conflicts that were symmetrical, orderly, and technologically polite. But reality delivered something else. Wars fought close to the ground, under constant uncertainty, with limited resources and broken logistics. In those conditions, elegance became weakness. And suddenly, the qualities dismissed as outdated began to matter again. The Mustang did not need speed to dominate the airspace. It needed persistence. It could stay aloft long after jets were forced to turn back. It could operate from rough strips carved out of dirt and steel matting. It tolerated abuse, imperfect fuel, imperfect maintenance, imperfect conditions. Where jets demanded the world adapt to them, the Mustang adapted to the world. This was the paradox no planner had prepared for. The P-51 returned not because it was the best aircraft available, but because it was the least demanding. It required fewer promises from the battlefield and made fewer demands in return. In wars where infrastructure collapsed first, that made all the difference. The aircraft that had been declared obsolete became essential not in air superiority, but in presence. Not in clean engagements at altitude, but in brutal, low-level work that kept armies moving and prevented collapse. And yet, this revival carried a dark truth. The Mustang was being asked to do a job it had never been designed for. It had been built to fly high, escort bombers, and fight other aircraft where altitude and speed mattered most. Now it was forced downward, into a realm filled with small arms fire, hidden positions, and unforgiving terrain. Its engine, optimized for performance, became a vulnerability. Damage that might have crippled other aircraft slowly could destroy the Mustang quickly. Pilots knew the risk. Commanders knew the numbers. But the choice was stark. Accept losses, or surrender control of the battlefield. So the Mustang flew. It flew because it could reach places jets could not. It flew because it could wait when others had to leave. It flew because doctrine had run out of alternatives. This was not a triumphant comeback. It was an admission that technology alone does not decide wars. That context matters more than capability, and that systems built for ideal conditions often collapse first when those conditions disappear. The Mustang's return exposed something uncomfortable about the post-war vision of air power. Progress had been measured too narrowly. Speed had been mistaken for dominance, and adaptability, the one trait that had defined wartime survival, had been undervalued in peace. Act 3 is where the story turns. The P-51 is no longer a relic waiting to be discarded. It is a solution flawed, dangerous, but available when the future fails to show up as planned. And this moment sets the stage for everything that follows. Because once the Mustang proved that obsolete did not mean useless, it opened the door to a second, far stranger career, one that would carry it far beyond the battlefields anyone had prepared for. Mustang's return solved one problem and created another. It could stay over the battlefield. It could operate where jets could not. It could reach places no modern aircraft was willing to follow. But it was never meant to live there. The P-51 had been designed for a different kind of war. High altitude, long range, controlled environments where speed and climb rate mattered more than armor or survivability. Its strengths had once been decisive. In its new role, those same design choices became liabilities. This was not a flaw in the aircraft. It was a flaw in how it was being used. At low altitude, the Mustang paid for its performance with fragility. Its liquid-cooled engine delivered extraordinary power, but depended on a vulnerable cooling system. A single hit in the wrong place could turn minutes into seconds. Pilots flying ground attack missions understood this reality every time they descended toward the target. There was no margin for error. There was no slow damage. When the engine failed, survival depended on luck. Commanders knew the risks, yet the missions continued. Because the battlefield demanded presence, and presence demanded sacrifice. The Mustang was doing the job, but it was doing it at a price that could not be hidden behind statistics or rhetoric. Losses mounted. Aircraft were destroyed not by enemy fighters, but by fire from the ground. Small-caliber weapons that barely mattered at altitude became lethal at low level. Weather compounded the danger. Icing, turbulence, and poor visibility turned routine missions into fatal traps. Many pilots never saw the shot that brought them down. This was the reality behind the Mustang's second life. The aircraft was not failing. The system around it was. The decision to rely on the Mustang for tasks better suited to heavier, more resilient aircraft exposed a deeper issue in post-war planning. In the rush toward jets, entire categories of capability had been abandoned. Alternatives that could have absorbed punishment aircraft designed for low-altitude attack and survivability were gone. What remained was a precision tool being used as a blunt instrument. Pilots adapted because they had no choice. They flew lower to improve accuracy. They stayed longer to support troops who depended on them. They accepted that each mission carried risks their aircraft was never designed to manage. Courage filled the gap left by planning. But courage is not a substitute for design. Every loss reinforced the same lesson. Adaptability has limits. The Mustang could be repurposed, but it could not be transformed. Its success came not from being ideal, but from being available. And availability, in war, often matters more than suitability. This tension defined the Mustang's post-war combat career. It was indispensable and vulnerable, effective and costly. Its presence changed outcomes on the ground, but at a human price that was impossible to ignore. Act 4 is where the paradox sharpens. The aircraft survived because it could adapt, but the men flying it paid for the system's mistakes. The Mustang's story after World War II is not one of simple triumph. It is a reminder that when institutions commit too fully to a vision of the future, they often leave themselves with only imperfect tools when reality intervenes. And yet, despite the losses, despite the danger, the Mustang did not disappear again, because even as its limitations became undeniable, its usefulness remained undeniable as well. The world was learning slowly, painfully, that progress does not erase the past, it repurposes it. And in wars fought at the margins of expectation, the line between obsolete and essential is far thinner than anyone wants to admit. The P-51 Mustang endured this phase not because it was invincible, but because there was still nothing else that could replace it. And that uneasy balance between necessity and sacrifice would carry the Mustang into the next, even stranger chapter of its life. Major powers rushed toward jets. A different kind of war began spreading across the world. These were not the wars of headlines or grand strategies. They were conflicts fought on the edges of empires, inside newly formed states, and across borders drawn faster than institutions could solidify. They were short on infrastructure, long on improvisation, and defined by scarcity rather than abundance. And in those wars, the future rarely showed up on time. Jets were expensive. They demanded fuel, trained crews, spare parts, and runways that many nations simply did not have. For countries emerging from colonial rule or struggling to stabilize fragile governments, modern air forces were a luxury they could not afford. What they needed was something else entirely. They needed aircraft that could fly tomorrow, aircraft that could be maintained with limited resources, aircraft that could intimidate opponents, support troops, and operate from whatever airfield happened to exist. This is where the Mustang found a new identity, not as a symbol of technological superiority, but as a tool of necessity. Across Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, the P-51 filled a role that jets could not. It became the backbone of air power for states whose wars were too small, too chaotic, or too politically inconvenient to justify cutting-edge solutions. The Mustang's appeal was simple. It was available, it was proven, and it could do many jobs well enough when perfection was not an option. It flew reconnaissance over disputed borders. It hunted supply convoys and insurgent camps. It escorted transport aircraft and intimidated ground forces that lacked air defenses. In these conflicts, air power was not about dominance, it was about presence. The sight and sound of a fighter overhead mattered more than its maximum speed. Endurance mattered more than climb rate. Reliability mattered more than elegance. The Mustang delivered all three. What made this phase remarkable was how little attention it received at the time. These wars did not define eras. They did not reshape global alliances. But they were real, and they were fought by pilots flying aircraft the world had already written off. The Mustang adapted not through redesign, but through improvisation. Weapons loads changed. Mission profiles evolved. Pilots learned to fly low, slow, and deliberately. The aircraft became a multi-purpose instrument fighter, bomber, reconnaissance platform depending on what the situation demanded. This flexibility extended its life far beyond expectations. In many places, the Mustang outlasted the jets that were supposed to replace it. New aircraft arrived with fanfare, then sat grounded when maintenance proved too complex or budgets too thin. Meanwhile, the older fighters kept flying, not because they were better, but because they worked. This reality exposed another flaw in post-war assumptions. Progress was measured by acquisition, not sustainability. Nations bought symbols of modernity without building the systems needed to support them. When those symbols failed, they turned back to what they could actually use. The Mustang became a bridge between eras, a reminder that air power is not defined by the newest machine, but by the one that fits the environment it is asked to operate in. Yet this was not a peaceful existence. These conflicts were often brutal, intimate, and politically messy. The Mustang flew close to the ground, close to civilians, and close to consequences. Its role blurred the line between deterrence and destruction. In wars without clear fronts or decisive victories, its missions were about control rather than conquest. And still, it remained. Act 5 marks the Mustang's transformation from a weapon of global war into an instrument of regional survival. It was no longer shaping the outcome of world history, but it was shaping the outcomes that mattered most to the people living under its shadow. This phase explains why the Mustang's story did not end with the rise of jets. Because while technology raced ahead in theory, reality lagged behind. And in that gap, the P-51 found purpose again. It became the aircraft for wars no one planned for. Wars that did not justify the future, but demanded the past. And as long as those wars existed, the Mustang had a reason to keep flying. Late 1,960 seconds, the world had moved on, or so it believed. Radar-guided missiles streaked across the skies of Southeast Asia. Supersonic jets dueled beyond visual range. Air combat had become abstract, technical, and distant. To most military thinkers, the era of piston-engine fighters was not just over, it was irrelevant. And yet, far from the centers of technological power, the old sky refused to close. In regions where politics lagged behind progress and budgets lagged behind ambition, the Mustang remained, not as a symbol of nostalgia, but as a practical reality. It continued to fly because replacing it required more than buying new aircraft, it required systems that did not exist. This tension reached its breaking point in a conflict that seemed almost impossible for its time. Two neighboring nations, bound by unresolved grievances and fragile diplomacy, went to war, not over ideology or superpower rivalry, but over land, migration, and resentment. The world barely noticed, but the air war that followed would quietly close a chapter of military history. In this conflict, both sides relied on aircraft designed decades earlier. Fighters built for World War II once again armed themselves for combat, not in training exercises or symbolic flyovers, but in real engagements where pilots hunted each other with guns and cannons. No missiles, no radar locks, no second chances. The skies over Central America became the stage for something no one expected to see again. Propeller-driven fighters meeting in air combat long after the jet age had arrived. For the pilots involved, this was not history repeating itself. It was survival. They flew low and close. They maneuvered visually. They depended on skill, awareness, and instinct rather than electronics. Every engagement unfolded at distances measured in hundreds of meters, not kilometers. Every mistake was immediate and unforgiving. In these encounters, the Mustang was no longer a stopgap or a repurposed solution. It was simply a fighter, one of the last of its kind, doing exactly what it had been designed to do. The irony was stark. While the world's most advanced air forces fought wars defined by technology, smaller nations fought wars defined by availability. They used what they had, and what they had still worked. This final phase of combat revealed the ultimate paradox of the Mustang's post-war life. It was considered obsolete not because it could no longer fight, but because the world had decided it should no longer need to. Yet, when circumstances stripped away assumptions, the fundamentals returned. Airspeed, maneuverability, endurance, and pilot skill mattered again. The Mustang proved that the principles of air combat had not vanished, they had merely been overshadowed. When the fighting ended, it did not make headlines. No doctrines were rewritten. No museums updated their exhibits overnight. But something irreversible had occurred. The last combat between piston-engine fighters was over, not because the Mustang failed, but because the world finally caught up to the future it had imagined decades earlier. Jets would now dominate even the smallest conflicts. Supply chains expanded, infrastructure improved, political alignments hardened. The conditions that had allowed the Mustang to survive in combat slowly disappeared. Act 6 is the quiet closing of a door. It marks the end of an era where adaptability could compensate for obsolescence, where an aircraft designed in urgency could remain relevant through ingenuity and necessity, where the past could still fight alongside the present. For the Mustang, this was not defeat. It was exhaustion. Its combat career had stretched across continents, ideologies, and generations. It had outlived its designers' expectations and its critics' predictions. It had fought wars no one planned for and survived decisions meant to erase it. And now, at last, the sky it had known was gone. What followed was not another battlefield but another transformation, because even when the Mustang could no longer fight, it refused to disappear. The Mustang finally vanished from active combat. It should have faded quietly into memory. That is how most weapons end their lives, not with a final battle, but with indifference. Once they stop being useful, they stop being remembered. They become statistics, footnotes. Museum placards read once and forgotten. The P-51 was supposed to follow that path. But something unexpected happened. As governments moved on and air forces modernized, a small group of people began moving in the opposite direction. They were not strategists or policymakers. They were pilots, mechanics, engineers, and collectors, many of them veterans who understood what the Mustang represented beyond its tactical value. They saw not an obsolete fighter, but a disappearing chapter of history. In the years after the war, countless Mustangs had been destroyed simply because no one imagined they would ever matter again. Those losses left scars. Scrapyards filled with cut airframes became symbols of a mistake made in confidence, the belief that the past had no future. For some, that belief was unacceptable. The effort to save Mustangs did not begin as an organized movement. It began as individual decisions made in hangars and storage fields. Someone chose to buy an aircraft instead of letting it be scrapped. Someone else chose to restore instead of discard. Another chose to keep flying when it would have been easier to walk away. These choices were expensive. They were time-consuming. And they made little sense on paper. Maintaining a piston-engine fighter decades after production ended required stubbornness bordering on obsession. Spare parts had to be found or recreated. Knowledge had to be preserved before it vanished. Skills once taught by necessity now had to be relearned by intention. Yet the Mustang attracted that effort in a way few aircraft ever had. Part of it was performance. Even decades later, the aircraft was still fast, powerful, and demanding. It rewarded precision and punished mistakes. Flying a Mustang was not casual, it was a commitment. But part of it was something deeper. The Mustang had become a witness. It carried the marks of multiple eras: global war, post-war neglect, improvised conflicts, and quiet persistence. Each restored aircraft represented not just engineering, but survival of a machine and of the people who refused to let its story end. As these aircraft returned to the sky, they took on a new role. They were no longer tools of war. They became carriers of memory. Air shows replaced airfields. Crowds replaced formations. The sound of a Merlin engine no longer meant danger, it meant connection. For audiences who had never known the war, the Mustang made history tangible. It flew, not as an abstraction, but as proof. This transformation changed how the aircraft was valued. Once sold for almost nothing, Mustangs became rare. Rarity created demand. Demand created investment. Restoration became an industry. Knowledge networks formed. What had once been surplus became irreplaceable. But this was not just about money. The Mustang's survival into the modern era challenged the same assumption that had nearly erased it after the war, that progress naturally makes the past irrelevant. Its continued presence suggested something else: that some technologies endure not because they are efficient, but because they are meaningful. The aircraft's post-combat life revealed an uncomfortable truth. Societies often discard what they no longer understand. Preservation requires effort, patience, and humility, qualities that are rarely prioritized in moments of confidence. By choosing to preserve the Mustang, its caretakers were doing more than saving metal. They were resisting a pattern, the pattern of declaring eras finished before their lessons had been absorbed. Act 7 is where the story slows, not because it loses importance, but because it gains weight. The Mustang no longer needed to prove its usefulness. It needed to prove its worth. And it did by continuing to exist. Against economics, against convenience, against the belief that history moves only forward. The P-51 survived this phase not through war or necessity, but through choice. The choice of individuals who understood that once something like this is gone, it is gone forever. And in refusing to let it die, they ensured that the Mustang would carry its story into a world that no longer remembered the conditions that created it. The factory that built the P-51 Mustang closed long ago. The assembly lines went silent. The blueprints were archived. The war that justified its existence ended generations ago, and yet the Mustang never truly left. Today, it flies in a world that no longer needs it for war. It appears at airfields turned into stages, not bases. Its engine no longer signals danger, but memory. When it passes overhead, people stop not because they are afraid, but because they recognize something rare. Continuity. The Mustang's survival forces an uncomfortable reflection. It was designed under pressure, built in urgency, and expected to be temporary. It was never meant to last 8 decades. Machines are not supposed to outlive the conflicts that created them. But the P-51 did because history did not behave as expected. After World War II, planners believed they had solved air warfare. Speed would dominate. Technology would simplify complexity. Progress would move cleanly from one generation to the next. The Mustang's continued relevance exposed the flaw in that thinking. War does not reward certainty. It rewards adaptability. The aircraft survived not because it was perfect, but because it could be repurposed. It filled gaps left by doctrine. It compensated for assumptions that collapsed under real conditions. And when its combat role finally ended, it found another life because people chose to remember what it represented. The Mustang's journey after 1945 is not just a technical story. It is a human one. It reflects how societies deal with success by discarding the tools that achieved it too quickly. It reveals how confidence can become vulnerability when it hardens into belief. And it shows how survival often belongs not to the most advanced systems, but to the most flexible ones. In the end, The P-51 became something few weapons ever do. It became a symbol not of victory, but of endurance. It endured strategic miscalculations. It endured technological revolutions. It endured neglect, repurposing, and reinvention. And it endures today because people refuse to let its story be reduced to a single chapter called World War II. Every time a Mustang flies now, it carries more than fuel and airspeed. It carries evidence. Evidence that progress is not a straight line, that the past does not disappear simply because the future arrives, and that understanding history requires more than celebrating what is new. It requires examining what was almost lost. The P-51 Mustang did not survive because it was untouchable. It survived because it kept answering questions the world did not expect to ask again. That is why it still matters. Not as a weapon, not as a relic, but as proof that some machines outlive their purpose because they expose truths that never stop being relevant. The Mustang was never just an airplane. It was a reminder, one, the world nearly destroyed, that assumptions end wars faster than enemies do. And this time, history chose not to forget it. This story changed how you see military history. Consider subscribing. We document the decisions, assumptions, and forgotten moments that shaped the Second World War and everything that came after it. Tell us where you're watching from. Your perspective is part of this history.